A very good afternoon to you and welcome to yet another Farmers Weekly Transition webinar. My name is Hugh Broom. Normally I present the Farmers Weekly podcast, which is the UK's leading farming podcast, released every week. But on this occasion, I've been asked to host this webinar, which is talking about opportunities around renewable energy. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've joined us for one of these before, you'll know the drill. If you haven't, listen up. We've obviously got stacks of questions for our panel, which came in over the last week or so. You also have an opportunity to send questions in as we go now, and you'll see on your screen there is a little text box and you can put your name in there, and please do send us a question. Tell us where you are in the country, and obviously put your question in there, and we'll run some of these live questions as well as some of the questions we've already had in from lots of people who've been sending questions in over the last week. So we've got a great panel here of very knowledgeable people when it comes to renewable energy. So we're going to sort of go around the room and get our panel to introduce themselves. First, we have Tim Foster, who is the Head of Energy Services at Conrad Energy. Tim, tell us something about yourself.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I am the product of the Farm Diversification Project. So my father persuaded me to leave the farm 25 years ago and pursue a career in energy. And since then, I have had various roles in organisations, either buying or selling energy, developing PPAs, contracts around renewable schemes, even was chairman of the British Hydropower Association for a little while as well. So that's what I'm up to, Hugh.
Thank you very much. Larry Irwin is a Senior Associate Director on the Renewables team at Strutton Barker and joins us live from his idyllic garden scene. Larry, tell us about yourself. You're in Scotland, aren't you?
Thank you very much, Hugh. Yes, based outside Aberdeen, and taking advantage of the good weather for once. So, but yes, that's right. Part of the Strutton Parker land agent, so part of our renewables team at Strutton Parker. And I deal generally when clients get approached for renewable projects and deal with on-the-ground leases and sale, etc.
Fantastic. Thank you, Larry. John Wadeson joins us from the AF Group, Anglia Farmers. John, you're a renewable project specialist. You're the AF Renewables expert.
Yeah, I run the renewables team at AF, and generally speaking, I do the majority of the engineering projects. I'm an engineer. I've worked with solar PV and renewable generation for many years. We also look at renewable heating systems, and we have a team also which takes on small scale PPA and export agreements for our farming members.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. And Richard Petty, who's the head of complex transactions at Lloyds Bank. You're into asset finance, basically, aren't you, Richard?
I am, yeah. To put that into real words, Hugh, I am the sustainability lead for asset finance in Lloyds Bank.
So you tend to get involved in financing and financing matters around renewable projects.
Absolutely. That's very much my bag, and I've probably been doing this for kind of 10 to 12 years on and off at different lenders.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much, panel. I should just say that this webinar will be turned into a podcast at some point in the future as well. As I say, please do send in questions as we go. The chat box is open on your screen. Great to hear from you that way. But first, let's go to one of our questions that we had sent in last week. It's from Robert Hattersley. And Robert wants to know, what are the size limits for installing PV energy collection on non-inhabited buildings before planning permission is required? And if a PV system is connected to battery storage for supplying to a power to a user who is not connected to the national grid, what are the limits and legal requirements? He also wants to know, how long can the batteries last? Larry, I'll throw that one to you first. Are there the size limits, and what's the main deal with planning when it comes to solar PV? Presumably it's different across different parts of the UK.
Thanks, Hugh. Yeah, I mean, dealing with the requirement for the planning side of things, my understanding would be that it's you'd look at the General Permitted Development Order, which is use class J, I think, for solar on non-domestic buildings. And I'm trying to remember what the triggers are, but I think it's about the roof type, the potential projection over the edge of a roof, and also the structural type of building that you're putting it on. In terms of capacity, I think the limit for the size of scheme on a non-commercial, which wouldn't require planning, is 1 megawatt, but I'd need to go back and just check what the legislation says about that. But I think, generally speaking, your best bet is, if you're not sure, go and speak to your local authority about a pre-app and find out whether you would need it. But generally speaking, you should be able to install solar on non-domestic. I'm not sure if he means by non-inhabited, he means commercial buildings. That's my assumption.
Yes, I'm not sure what he means with that. What I can tell you, because I farm in the A&OB down here in the Surrey Hills, and if you're in a protected landscape, then your permitted development rights to chuck it on the roof go out the window. So you have to do full planning permission. John, Robert mentions battery storage in the same line as solar PV. Now, obviously, if he's not connected to the grid, he's going to need the battery storage. But presumably, if you are connected to the grid, would you necessarily put battery storage straight in with your solar panels if you were installing them?
Generally speaking, we always encourage people, if they are connected to the grid, to perhaps look at putting the solar in first, particularly if there's a degree of usage on site. If there is no usage on site and you are entirely exporting back to the grid, then yeah, obviously the battery storage, the only reason for that would then be to change the discharge timing of your solar PV so that you can maybe get better benefits from your export provider, giving you better payments for different times during the day.
No, that's cool. And Tim, in your experience, Robert mentions in his question about battery life, when you guys put in lots of battery storage systems and you have put lots in, what do you budget for an average the battery? How long should it last for?
Well, the sites are going to be operational for 20, 25, 30 years. So that's the site life. I expect in the battery, most of the warranties you see on them are 10 years plus, bigger sites. Obviously, you can pay for larger, longer dated warranties than that, but that's typically where it stops out. I think with smaller schemes, typically I've seen things around about sort of 5-7 years, but they're very much as a specific sort of attachment to any smaller battery system. So I think the advice here is to check the small print, ask the question about the warranty agreement, and also just seeing what it's backing up. And I suspect it's probably also worth thinking about the sort of strength of the person putting that battery site in. I go back sort of 10 years to the early feed-in tariff solar, and how many of those sort of smaller end providers are no longer with us in a business sense. So another thing we're just looking at, if you're looking at expensive capex like a battery system, make sure there's somebody around to back that warranty up over the course of the time period.
Yeah, you want to be left 10 years down the line with no thing. Richard, in terms of financing, I mean, presumably you guys look at this in the long term. If a battery is going to last 25 or it's a 25, 30-year system, are banks generally happy to finance these sort of projects for that length of time, or do they want shorter loan terms?
We like to be inside the warranty life. So we like at the end of our financing term there to be a little bit of life. So discussions we're having is a 10-year battery would probably go to 7-year term. 7-year battery would probably go to a 5-year term. Obviously, all of that then links in with credit strength of your borrower. But broadly speaking, if you're inside the warranty period, you should be fine.
No, that's great. In terms of the sort of, I mean, batteries are a bit of a thing, aren't they, Tim? Because some of them are they're relatively new to the market. I suppose it's no different than solar. How do you, I mean, do you rely on the warranty, Tim, or are there certain places you buy batteries in the same way? There are certain places you would or wouldn't buy a tractor or a car. I don't know. I mean, what's the deal here?
I think with everything new, we're sort of in that introductory period. I mean, if you think about it, I've just taken delivery of an electric vehicle, and again, you're looking at the small print around that and wondering, my lease of that is going to be less than the sort of 7 years type period where most things, most people seem to view that you might need to change the battery pack on an EV. I think we are in the early stages of the sort of batteries development side of things. I think there is this sort of view of you can maintain, switch out things. I mean, the larger battery sites, when you're talking about the battery modules, they're literally the size of a desktop PC, and you can pull one cassette out and put another one back in. So it does allow you to monitor, to replace when the performance starts going down. But I think everybody's in that sort of learning curve, and I think Richard's point on from a bank funding point of view was also sort of pointed out everybody's looking to see what these models or what the actual delivery is compared to the model or the agreement that's been put in place. And again, it's the same thing as solar. Go to a good supplier. We talk about tier one suppliers in the solar and battery sector. So these are people with a bit of strength, a bit of reputation behind them to fix things if they do go wrong.
Yeah, so they'll actually turn up when there's a warranty call. They just won't not answer the phone forever. John Evans, John Evans, Hare's Fruit Partner. I can't make out his name. It's John Evans, Hare's Fruit Partner. It says on the screen. John is at Hare's Fruit. Obviously, John has got some solar PV on his roof because he wants to know. And John, I'll put this to you first. What's the best way to secure a reasonable rate for any exported energy from solar PV? Your view first, John. How would you? I suppose you tell him to come and phone you guys at AF, wouldn't you?
There's lots of organisations out there. I know Tim Foster is belongs to an organisation we've also spoken to at AF. It really depends on the size of system that you're looking for. Now, if you have a relatively small system or a domestic system, then there's some pretty good deals on SEG out there for small users. Realistically, you're not going to be looking at a PPA for anything under 50 kilowatts. Perhaps down to 30 for systems that export most of their generation. Realistically, PPAs that deliver very good value tend to start quite a lot higher than that and up in the 100, 200 kilowatt margin. At AF, we do work with some suppliers that will provide PPA export payments for systems down to 30 kilowatts.
And just for those of us not in the know, John, can you explain what a PPA is, please?
Yeah, PPA is a power purchase agreement. It's a contract that you have with a supplier to purchase your energy from you. It's slightly different to the Smart Export Guarantee, which is the government's backed system that is used by much smaller generators. Most agricultural generators, other than people with PV systems on farmhouses, small wind turbines, and most industrial and commercial scale PV will be able to get onto a PPA in most cases.
And Tim, your view in terms of PPAs, I mean, presumably these give you some, I mean, I suppose you can choose different ones. Presumably I could choose a flat rate one and lock in for 12 months if I thought the market was going to do X, or you could put me on a tracker one. How does it work?
Yeah, I mean, you can have any number of options. I was going to say most people already have quite an idea of where energy rates are. If you're buying diesel, fertilizer, selling grain, those commodity prices you're seeing are pretty much similar to where we're seeing energy prices. Gas is the link between all of them, and gas is still drives the power price up and down. So as a farmer, landowner, if you're buying any of those, if you're trading any of those, you'll have a good idea where energy prices are generally. So that's the first thing I was going to say. The second thing just about it is information. Make sure you've got the system details down. Make sure if you've got half-hour data, if you've got performance data, that all helps to counter uncertainty. And then, I suppose, just to answer your question, Hugh, it depends on your view of risk. So if you've got a scheme where you perhaps spoken to Richard at Lloyd's and is funding it, he will ask you to go and lock it away for as long as possible at a price that services the debt. So that's right at one end. If you are bullish, if it's a scheme where it's bought and paid for, and you would like to play the market, there are all sorts of spot prices that can work for you. The only counter to that, Hugh, is worth mentioning. In days when it's particularly sunny or particularly windy, spot prices have a tendency of going quite low, just because there's too much of it. So we've had sort of stories of negative prices around quite a bit of Europe in the last couple of weeks because of overproduction of solar and wind. And then, of course, when the opposite happens, when there is no wind and no solar, the prices go high. So if you're lucky enough to have a wind turbine or a solar site that's outside those sort of UK typical averages, you'll do well out of that. But keep an eye on the weather, buy yourself some time, get your data together, talk to John or us directly or something like that. But yeah, cast yourself around the market a bit is probably the advice on that.
And the minimum for those PPAs would be what, sort of 50 kilowatt installation?
We do PPAs down to 25 kilowatts.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll always have a chat about it, just to see what's the best, and that's the key point. Get, as I said, buy yourself some time, talk to people around the marketplace, see what people offer, and just check your expiry date as well. That's the other thing that's particularly prevalent, is that quite often these go to deemed rates, which are a lot lower than anything contractually. So just keep half an eye on when your contract expires.
Oh, because it'll suddenly just drop to nowhere if you're not careful before you've got time to move it on.
Or it's also renewed to something lower.
You've also renewed for another 10 years at 2p. Yes. Yeah, that'd please Richard no end. Right. Well, tell you what, we'll move off solar for a minute. There was quite a few questions came in talking about AD, anaerobic digestion. And I think there's my personal view, not that matters, but I think we see a lot of massive big AD plants, don't we? And they've erupted everywhere. There's lots all over the country, particularly where they're sort of putting crops and muck in and producing gas. We don't see so many micro AD plants over here, and there's potentially more in other parts of Europe. I mean, certainly Germany went mad. I'll come to you first, John. There are lots of questions here. Brian Price asked the question. I've also got another question from Andy Foote. What are the options for anaerobic digestion on a small scale, and particularly where you're limited in terms of your infrastructure? So if you've only got, say, single phase electric, for example, right up the end of a farm lane, miles from anywhere.
I think the first thing I'd say is AD plants do come in lots of different shapes and sizes. We deal with, at AF, we work with a supplier called Cube Renewables, who are able to provide containerized micro AD systems. AD systems, because of the fact that they come in lots of different shapes and sizes, they also come rated from various different feedstocks. So depending on how you want to do it, Cube have systems that are available to work with dairy farms to use animal waste. They also have a link up with another organisation that enables them to do gas collection systems for slurry lagoons, which enables you to tap off that as a feed for your AD plant as well. So yeah, there's lots of different types. Very few people do micro AD in the UK, and I know Cube are quite specialist in this area, having originally developed their systems working for the British military out in the Middle East. So.
I mean, Tim, do you think, Tim, you see the larger scale stuff, and you've been at the coalface of quite big renewable projects for a long time? Can you see there's an opportunity, particularly for smaller scale farmers? Someone that for these, particularly like we produce a couple of thousand tons of FYM a year. Now we put it in fields and we stack it and then we spread it. But isn't there something groovy we could be putting it through and selling Johnson or use some electric, or doesn't it stack up?
I think it's a lot of it depends on whether I would say that I suppose there's a couple of things here. One of which is at the feedstock, have you got enough of it, even at a small scale? And secondly is what do you do with the gas that comes out of the AD scheme? So if you're thinking about, we've got a large existing gas infrastructure. So the simplest, easiest solution would be to get that gas back into the grid at whatever time. And the chances are that possibly there might be a gas main up the farm track as well, possibly. But again, it's probably the same. And the other thing is then looking at electricity generation. I think what we're seeing is all farms are coming under pressure to decarbonize, to show an environmental improvement. There is concern, obviously, about particularly dairy herds, etc., the methane emissions. So anything that comes along that sort of basis is beneficial. And I think there's always a solution contractually to do that. It's just, the smaller AD schemes, there is an aggregation argument for aggregation to get the gas together. A lot of corporates are looking for green gas. If you're going to build a gas-fired CHP site, combined heat and power site at a distribution centre, then it would be nice to back it up with a sustainability story which says, we're purchasing our gas from a a series of farms within 20 miles radius or something like that. So I can see that playing through quite well. I think, and I guess I'd be interested if Larry and perhaps has had these views as well. It is difficult to get a small project away as it is a big project away. And I think when you talk about the consent in the environmental side of things, I think that is probably more the hindrance. It's just as difficult if you're building a small micro AD as you're building one that's servicing, generating megawatts of electricity.
Yeah, Larry, have you come across smaller scale AD, Larry, with the work that you've done, or is it mainly on the bigger side?
Predominantly, it would be the bigger stuff that I have come across, albeit slightly limited because there hasn't been as many AD plants north of the border. But I think the point that was being made by Tim is absolutely right in that the consenting process is going to be the same regardless of scale. It's just how much resource you've got to throw at it. I have come across similar to the cube one that was being referred to. I've come across another one, Muckbuster, which is a farm scale AD. And certainly I've looked at that with a number of clients with a view to not just energy security, but also looking further down the tracks. North of the border, we've had the same discussions with like SEPA about dealing with nitrogen, etc. And we've got MVZs. South of the border, you've got nutrient neutrality coming through and biodiversity net gain, etc. So they're all the drivers that says, well, if you've got something, can you use this as a sustainable means of creating energy and indeed insulating yourself from the wider market side of things? And that's certainly where I've spent quite a bit of time with clients, is looking at, well, can you make this work from a financial perspective? And then it kind of comes back to some of the conversations that you'd have with the likes of Richard and funders for clients as to, well, what capital requirements do you need to get this project to go? What's your sort of return on that investment? And ultimately, from an environmental and commercial perspective, does it make sense? But I certainly would support it. I think it's a good thing to look at.
Yeah, in particular, we have MVZs this side of the border as well, Larry. We've got those.
We don't have the ultra cells. No, I appreciate that.
No, we don't have ultra cells. It's a beautiful thing that's spread everywhere. But what we also, and the other thing, of course, obviously you've got emissions profiling across the board, thinking particularly dairy beef systems. The ammonia thing hasn't really happened yet, but at some point, we are expecting ammonia to become a contentious or a regulated, or potentially to become a regulated issue within some animal systems. So it would help service or help to solve that problem as well. Richard, do you have an appetite to fund small scale AD? What do you? How do I convince you to lend me lots of money on the basis that I'm going to produce enough farmyard manure to make it work? What's the deal here?
I'm afraid I'm relatively pessimistic on anaerobic digestion, Hugh, simply because of the experience of having seen a number of them go wrong. Big focus would be on the operator. How professional are they? How much do they know what they're doing? From the experience I have with AD, there's a huge difference simply because if you get the mix of feedstock wrong, they will require evacuation at cost. All the while, you're probably still paying for your feedstock on the assumption that you've had a secured feedstock contract to have it financed. So that's a lot of cash going out the door at the same time if things do go wrong. You're still paying for your feedstock. You're stacking that up if it's on a take or pay contract. You're paying for the evacuation. Are there penalties under your offtake agreement, under your PPA for the gas? There's quite a fair bit of caution among lenders. That said, it's not impossible. With a substantial level of equity, somebody who knows what they're doing, who's got some experience running AD plants in the past. But I would caution the listeners to consider that there's likely to be a substantial amount of equity investment, and there's probably going to be additional security to bolster the lender's position, at least at let's call them a tier one kind of high street bank sort of level. There will always be other lenders who are looking to take a bit more risk, but they will probably also look for a bit more return as well, of course.
And can you see it? The cube systems that John refers to, the Muckbusters one that Larry refers to, these are relatively small scale. They're the equivalent to buying a big posh tractor in terms of the amount that's being spent here. Do you think there'd be an appetite to fund that sort of smaller asset? You could argue it's no different to funding a tractor or a feeder wagon. It's a potentially an essential part of the business that relies on the rest of the farm business running.
I would disagree, because your tractor, your other machine equipment, you can take it up to auction and you can go and get some value for it. With something that's effectively there on site, it's pipe work, really. There's not much that you can take kind of externally. And while we can take additional security, we can go and take some land as security. We don't want to do that. We'd much rather actually that things work and that we're kind of repaid in the first instance. So my view is the smaller AD plants would be tough from my perspective, at least kind of looking at it from Lloyd's, because of the due diligence you would need to do. Makes it much more economic if you're doing the larger scale deals.
So yes, we either need to have a lot of cash in the bank, or we need a generous government scheme like they had in Germany, where they'll just come along and pay for most of it, and then watch it. But I mean, they seem to work quite well there. Right, let's go to. I have got a question here from Rob Stapley, going back to PV panels. Actually, Rob is from Rotherfield Farms. He looks after 5 PV solar sites for a traditional rural estate in Hampshire. He has been looking for a service engineer to come and service his PV setups, and he has been let down time and time and time again. And clearly, it's getting on his wick, because he's taken the trouble to send a question in live tonight to ask about it. Tim, I mean, it's a big problem, isn't it, this? Because trying to find good contractors that turn up when they say they're going to turn up. And presumably, if I go and spend a couple £100,000 on a ground-mounted or roof-mounted solar setup, it is going to need some attention, isn't it? And you've got to factor that into the sum.
Yeah, Hugh, I was hoping you weren't going to ask me that question, because unfortunately, that is the issue with the industry at that smaller scale. So large-scale solar systems, like the ones we have, we develop, you put that into a contract, an O&M contract, and they are maintained regularly, and there are very strict contractual conditions for them to do that. I think the issue is with with the smaller schemes is that the people do not turn up. I've got a small scheme on my roof at home. It was meant to be serviced as part of the agreement I had when they put the installation in. I saw the service engineers once, and it's been in for 9 years now. So I service it myself. I go up and I clean the panels on the roof, which is where probably the predominant of the servicing becomes. But I think that is, I can't answer a question. I cannot point out anybody that I would say would service as a sort of national service of the smaller scale solar schemes. I don't know if John maybe has some experience on this.
John, do your clients, are they getting frustrated because they can't find people to service? I mean, servicing solar panels, presumably it's a squeegee, isn't it? And checking that the cables all work, checking that there's not bird muck all over it, and presumably the inverters are on the ground and the electrician can come and change them if they're faulty.
Yeah, the way I tend to look at this, and the way I tend to advise the AF members, is that solar panels are generally, if you install the right system in the first place, they are fairly fit and forget. Now, in terms of cleaning, I only recommend people clean them if they are visibly dirty. Like you say, if they're covered in bird's mess or they're getting lichen or moss on them, then yes, they definitely need cleaning. If they've got a film of dust on them because it's in a farmhouse next to some fields that's in harvest time, then yeah, they don't generally need cleaning. Most of that will wash off when it rains. So look at them from the perspective of, do they visibly need that servicing? The inverters and the other parts of the system are, again, generally fairly reliable. Mainstream solar PV is now becoming 10 or 15 years old, so there are some inverter failures happening. One of the things that a lot of our members fall into is that their inverters, they've bought an extended warranty on it. The inverter's 9 years old now. They've got a 10-year warranty. The warranty comes from a third-party company for the manufacturer, so the system gets the inverter will get removed, taken away, and there's no time scale. There tends to be no time scale on the return of that, so it could be months. And if it's this time of the year and you're losing your fit and your generation for that period of time in the sunniest part of the year, then yeah, that's kind of tough. So a lot of people are actually looking at whether they can actually replace the inverters with modern inverter systems, which are arguably better anyway, at less cost than what they would lose in fit for sending something back for warranty. So we work with a number of providers that are very good at doing this throughout the UK. So yeah, certainly anyone that wants to look at servicing and maintenance, yeah, please give me a shout. I can't say that we'll be able to respond tomorrow, but we will be able to put you in touch with somebody that can do the work for you.
Larry, do you have problems north of the border trying to get people to come and service stuff? And is there a good availability of backup with this kit?
To be honest, it's not really an issue that I've had to deal with that often, to be honest. I mean, the schemes that I have been involved with tend to be ground-mounted schemes, and they haven't had the same issues, certainly.
There you go. You just put them in, and then the poor owners have to deal with it all or get out there with their squeegee. Right, now, there are lots of questions. There's quite a lot of questions come in talking about hydroelectricity projects. Obviously thinking small scale. One, for example, here from Rupert Todd, what's the potential for developing hydropower in hillier, wetter regions like the north of England to supplement farm income? Tim, is that something that you guys are racing up the M6 to install?
I wish it was. The answer is it is very difficult to. There's all sorts of issues around how you, and again, I suspect Larry has far more information on this than I do, but certainly in the way that water is utilised, there's a lot of concern about taking water out and putting it back in, and how that impacts on it, on the actual river or the stream quality. So the British Hydropower Association years ago looked at a study of potential sites around the UK, and this was right the way down to the micro level, existing, old mill sites, for example, potentially repowering all those. And by the time they worked through the list, you're going from thousands down to a few tens of sites which are developable, if that's the right word to use, because of the issues around things such as the Water Framework Directive, planning, consenting, grid connection, all those sort of issues. Fish particularly with fish-friendly turbines.
But if we extrapolate ourselves, Tim, out of the permitting side, so whether it's planning permission, getting the EA abstraction license, diversion license, yada yada yada, the physics of it, is it viable if you could magically just get all that licensing, or is it something that sits on a bit of a cusp in terms of the viability of it?
No, I think that they are. I mean, if you look at sort of Archimedean screw turbines, which are the ones we quite often see, or crossflow turbines, which look like an old lawnmower, the blades going round and round, they work well. At the micro level, and it's the same with any micro generation, be it wind, solar, or hydro, if you're using that power locally before it exports the grid, then you're avoiding those grid costs. So your energy cost, you're avoiding energy costs, are not just the commodity, which is sort of typically around about 10 pence, but the whole delivery cost as well. So your economics, your delivered energy costs, effectively double the income you get, because you're avoiding 20-25 pence. So if you've got a farm, a business where it has a stream or a river with a reasonable flow rate that's can sustain a small 5, 10, 20, 50 kilowatt scheme, whatever the size, and you can use that power without putting it into the grid, then they make sense, subject to the permitting and consenting.
Larry, is it something that you deal with? I mean, Scotland, you've got plenty of rain up there, certainly more than we have down here in the south. Do you see lots of hydro?
I wouldn't say I see lots of it, but I've certainly had some involvement in it. And again, I think the points are well made in that one of the challenges with run-of-river schemes is also the fact that you need a sufficient volume of water and head, i.e. the height, in order to get reasonable generation out of it, and that's where it can also become quite expensive, because the longer you need to run your penstock, your intake, pipework, etc., that can become quite expensive. And then there's also the sort of engineering challenges behind the installing that in the first place. But I mean, they certainly do make sense. I think, as you say, that if you can get past the permitting, and I'm trying to remember from SEPA, and it's probably the same down south, they refer to this Q mean, which is you're only allowed to take a certain percentage of water out when it's above a certain minimum threshold. And so there's automatic restrictions on, particularly this time of year, you'll see quite a few hydro schemes that stop generating just simply because the flow gets below a level that you're allowed to extract anything. So It is seasonal, but to a certain extent, it does match the profile of energy demand in that, winter, more rain, hopefully, and more usage. So it can make sense if you can get it.
Get your solar panels out in the summer and let the fish swim around the turbine at the same time. I mean, John, you're in East Anglia, you're in Norfolk, you've got loads of water. I'm assuming you don't do much in the way of hydro or have much crossover with hydro, do you?
No, we have a bit of a problem in East Anglia with the elevation to get the head of water as well, being fairly flat. I have actually worked on a couple of hydro projects for the Environment Agency historically, but I'm going back a good few years, and that was over towards the Midlands. But they were off-grid systems for powering sluice gates and locks, which were managed in conjunction with solar PV. So, but that was totally off-grid. So.
Yeah, no, it needs a bit of a balance there. Now, on the other one that we've had lots of questions about is talking about wind. Lots of questions around planning permission and just wind in general. Tim, start us off on this. We're going to start our wind section now. Start us off on. Give us a quick roundup on where we're to with government policy on wind. I know there's loads of windmills off the coast of Sussex, and there's loads off the coast of Humberside. There's loads out at sea. We're not seeing many inland. Is that correct?
No, and I think it's still very, very difficult to get a wind project consented. There are a few that sort of sneak through, but there is it seems to be really difficult. Comrade Energy would develop them if we could. It's just very difficult to find a site where there's got the wind resource, the grid connection, and you're not beset by local and potentially national objections to you developing that. So I think it's still very problematic. I think the message coming out of the government over the last 12 months has not been particularly helpful. It's a bit confused. We are still in an energy crisis. We are still reliant on importing fuel from countries where there is government and foreign and Commonwealth Office travel advisories. It would suggest that maybe you might want to try and maximise our own indigenous resource of energy, however that is. So I don't think the policy is quite joined up. And certainly, as I said, you still see some projects coming through, but nothing substantive onshore. Certainly the offshore projects, yes, but not the onshore.
And where you've had experience of some of the, obviously there was a big push of inland, of land-based wind development, probably 20 to stopped about 10 years ago, didn't it? 8-10 years ago, and the government changed the policy. Where those are installed, they're obviously working well and they're generating well. On the basis that there might be a change of policy, if there was a change of government, who knows what's going to happen. Presumably, if you think you've got a wind site, you've got a power connection, what should you do to prep that? I mean, presumably you need to do some sort of wind analysis of the wind that you have, do you?
If that's to me, Hugh, I think, yes, you need to get a feasibility study in place. And then you're looking at sort of a general assessment scoping of the issues. So the usual questions with any sort of generation project is what are the barriers? We talked about hydropower, we talked about solar. Are you in an area of outstanding natural beauty? Where is your grid connection? You may have 33 or 132 kilowatt lines going across your land, but the grid capacity may not be there. So there are a few steps you need to take initially. You need to get a consultant involved. If you have a land agent, they will be able to help as well around that. But it's you'll quite quickly discover whether or not you have a viable project, even if it's a small level. I mean, the thing that's hurting at the moment is grid connections, really, and the ability to get power out of a site. And I think that will, that's not something that's going to lift in the foreseeably short term. So, do a bit of due diligence and see what, have a chat with your neighbours as well and see what the local lie of the land is.
See how if they love the idea, the swooshing, the romantic swooshing of a 1 megawatt turbine. Larry, what's the deal with wind north of the border? Because I mean, you've got loads of it. They put loads in, and they've slowed down again. Is there opportunity there? Do you think?
There is, yes, and like you say, I mean, it's a substantially different legislative background where effectively it's being encouraged, and we are still seeing reasonably significant wind farm sites coming through. And I've got a client who's looking to self-develop a sort of 200 megawatt scheme at the moment. So a lot of the obvious sites were developed early on, as you say, particularly when there was much more subsidized support for it. It did fall off the agenda for quite a few years, but it's come back on again. It is a challenge to compete with the offshore, just because simply, offshore, I think from memory, it's about a 20% efficiency difference already. And clearly they can go for huge turbines that are much more effective than what we can currently get onshore consented. But yeah, there's very much an appetite for it. And I think, like you say, those early wind farms are coming up for repowering. And to be honest, whether you're north or south of the border, if you've already got a wind farm or a wind turbine site, the first thing really to look at is, if you're getting to the end of that initial period, is did you have a time limited consent in the first place? Because if not, and certainly up here there were a number of ones granted where actually they dispensed with the time limit. But if it was time limited, then your first protocol is to go back and find out what you need to do to get that extended.
Richard, did you like funding wind because I remember years ago, a friend in Scotland, and they were looking at 750 kilowatt turbines about 10 years ago. And the bank said to him, you get the planning permission and I'll secure it on the circle, the base of the pylon bit of the field, and away you go. I mean, did you like funding turbines?
So I've not done any myself, but I've had a bunch of colleagues who've done some. The view that's been shared with me is that at a larger scale is actually one of the better types of bank financing, because you get the statistical probability from the feasibility studies that Tim was referring to. So, you've got your debt sizing, how much do I lend against this project? How likely is it to repay? Is actually relatively easy to understand. You get a 90% probability, you get a 75% probability that the wind will blow. And then, as a consequence, your debt sizing kind of comes from that relatively quickly. The smaller scale stuff, in principle, should be possible. But because you don't have those, they don't necessarily warrant those full scale analyses. They do become a little bit more difficult, because how do you as a lender confirm that this wind turbine is going to make as much money as you think it is? And how much money do you think it makes? Do you think it makes £1 million? Do you think it makes £100,000? How do you, if you were to say that I'll count 60% of that income, what is your starting point? So, kind of in answer to the question, if you've got that statistical analysis over the correct period of time, you can get the probability. I'm very comfortable. It's a great lend, but it's all got to start from that principle of having the due diligence, and does the project economically stack up enough to warrant that kind of investment first.
And John, in terms of, do you deal much with wind? I mean, presumably you've got clients with smaller scale, house or farm size, small scale turbines running.
Yeah, we have lots of members within AF that run wind turbines very successfully in many cases, not so successfully in some cases. The wind turbines that we see predominantly tend to be in the kind of 10 to 50 kilowatt size. Tends to be the kind of generic on-farm turbines that, in terms of the way in which they produce their power, they are pretty good. But you have to factor in a lot of maintenance, which you don't get with solar PV, for example. Even a little Gaia 11 kilowatt wind turbine will produce annually probably the same as a 30 or 40 kilowatt solar array. So, but then you have to factor in that the actual cost of that turbine and the running cost of that turbine will probably also be 3 or 4 times what the solar array is. So most people, now that the fit has ended, tend to be looking at solar PV, particularly if they've got roof space, as the way that they can generate, pretty good power to cover their own usage. The other nice thing about solar PV for doing the work is that even though you might get a cloudy day, the sun's going to rise in the morning and it's going to set at night. You might be without wind for days during the period where you use it the most.
Yeah, no, it's yes. If you get a still still calm winter like we had, it's a bit of a tricky thing. One question has just come in from Dean Turner. This is an interesting one, and I think Tim, you touched on it earlier. Does anyone have experience of fugitive methane harvesting? It seems a lot simpler than an AD plant to capture the energy from stored slurry. So this is obviously there's the company down in Cornwall, isn't it, where they put these huge bags over a slurry lagoon and go in and harvest the methane weekly. Is that something any of the panelists, Tim, have you had any experience of this?
I'm going to have to disappoint and say I've had no experience of that at all, actually.
John, have you had any experience of it?
I know it is something that, again, I'm referring to Cube Renewables. I'm sure the other suppliers will do something similar as well. But because of the in the industry, the rules and regulations have tightened up about covering your slurry lagoons and making sure that you harvest away any rainwater correctly. There is obviously an element of covering the slurry lagoon, which will allow you to actually harvest any methane that is generated from that. And I know the guys at Cube have a system for doing this, which they call lagoon gas. And yeah, they utilize the gas that comes off there in much the same way as they do the gas that's generated from the micro AD plants. So it's not something I've had direct experience with yet, but we do have a few members that are interested in it and are looking at this process.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a no-brainer if you think about it, because a lot of people have got the storage there. It's effectively just building something on top of it and gathering that gas. Larry, have you had any experience of this at all, harvesting methane from existing slurry storage?
I'm afraid I've not actually. I mean, much like John says, I've come across it from other people third hand, but not directly.
Yeah, no, it's hugely lots and lots of potential there going forward. Someone mentioned again one of the questions around wind and size of wind turbines and one thing and another. Someone puts in the word that we sort of see a bit about, but we don't see it that much: geothermal. What are the options, guys? Who wants to pick up on this one? Tim or John? Who's had any experience with geothermal? They built some houses down the road from me about 2 years ago on an estate, a very lovely little bespoke development of 10 houses for rental, and they've all got a little geothermal pipe on them. Is that something that's good to have, John?
Well, shamefully, I'm going to have to concede that I don't have a lot of experience of this. I actually grew up in New Zealand, and in New Zealand, about 20 to 25% of their power comes from geothermal. And so, yeah, I come from an area that is heavily into geothermal. But yeah, looking at our geography in the UK, it's certainly not as simple a prospect as it is in New Zealand. For actually generating power from geothermal. Actually using the geothermal locally as a heat source, again, that's something that I don't have any experience of, but I know people do that.
We'd have lava close enough to the surface. I mean, Tim, presumably geothermal, geothermal is effectively ground source heat pump, but going down 1,000 meters as opposed to going a meter under a 2-acre paddock.
Well, I was just wondering if the question was actually asking whether or not we're looking at ground source heat pumps or proper geothermal, as in drill many kilometers into the earth. So Thrive Renewables, for example, have just developed a geothermal plant in Cornwall. They're generating power through a steam turbine. So they've drilled, I can't remember if it's five kilometers or something like that down into the Earth's core, pulling water down, generating steam, and it's running through a steam turbine. So that's up and running not far from the Eden project, if you're ever down there, which is quite an interesting one. So I wonder if that's they're few and far, between those opportunities. And John said they're probably more akin to countries such as New Zealand or Iceland. I think the other opportunity is more around the sort of heat pumps sort of ideas. And I've seen those both, ground, sort of in ground source heat pumps. I've seen them in riverbeds, and of course air source. But I think they're all very useful for providing heat at a certain level, a certain grade of heat. The thing to think about those is they're also demand electricity as well. So as we move more and more towards electrification of things such as heating and and transportation, then obviously that puts further demand on systems. So if you're looking at a farm installation where you have multiple energy generation sources, be it gas, PV, wind, ground source, heat pumps, then you're at least hedging your bets around that sort of energy production side of things.
And Larry, have you done much with ground source or geothermal?
Geothermal only once, when I had a client that looked at it, because going back to your point about, I think they ended up looking at the British Geological Society's data to have a look and see there is an area near where I am in Aberdeenshire which does have potential for it, but the problem has always been it's not sufficiently close to anywhere that you would do a sort of district scheme to justify the expense. So I'm not aware of any geothermal projects that I've come across up here. And from the ground source heat pump side of things, yes, we had a number of clients that got quite excited about this, particularly when you had also the domestic and non-domestic RHI schemes going for this, and particularly with historic houses, etc., where cost of heating these things was quite significant, and potentially to get a subsidized heating system installed was quite attractive. So, but yeah, I mean, I think I've not seen much beyond that from my experience.
Yeah, it's not often you got densely populated areas on very geothermally active land. Richard, you guys haven't got. Have you funded any geothermal projects?
Not to the best of my knowledge.
No,
it probably won't surprise you to know. Over the years, I've had a number of conversations on and off about ground source heat pumps, but I haven't funded any of those either. My favourite was a supermarket chain who were going to put them under all of their car parks, but I think that proved a little too ambitious in the end.
No, exactly. It's something they have to keep looking at. Right, here's a practical question from Phil Webb. How concerned should landowners be that developers of renewable energy projects are no longer agreeing, according to his experience, to put reinstatement security on risk from the start of leases? Does this cause a problem going forward? I mean, is this common out? Are developers, Tim, tending not to put reinstatement in, or is this purely down to individual negotiations? And actually, as a landowner manager, what should you be thinking about when you rock up on their farm wanting to cover it in solar panels or whatever project you want to do?
Crikey, it's a complicated question there, Hugh. I think it depends on the developer. What you're looking at. There is usually, I mean, one of the biggest risks. We had an event at one of our sites on last Friday, and that was one of the questions that came up, was about the effective reinstatement at the end of the project life, and whether or not there's a sinking fund or a bond or something that's put in place as the project goes through, that this money is available just in case the developer has disappeared or the site's been sold several times by the fact you get to the end of life. So I think it is a genuine concern around there. I think a lot of this then points to your choice of developer as well. It's potentially an opportunity to do some due diligence around a scheme. I think one of the things that one of our host farmers commented to us about was the fact that you effectively got a 20-25 year relationship with somebody, and you go in with your eyes open. So I think the point is do your work, ask around, see what the developer's like, and then you start taking a view. And then, particularly if schemes are being financed, and Richard will probably come back on this point, but Richard's funding will have a whole string of conditions around the whole project life cycle, and developers will be asked to put money into certain funds to ensure that work is done, and that might be landscaping work at the start, and it might be reinstatement work at the end of the project.
Larry, what are the? I mean, what do you see as the pitfalls in terms of reinstatement? If someone comes onto your land and wants to come onto your land for 25 years, let's say it's a solar project, and presumably you would, if you were negotiating for a client, you would ask them to remove the kit at the end of the 25 years. That would be part of the deal, would it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, typically what you're looking for is returning that site back to its former condition. So, as a a point of negotiation within your heads of terms, assuming it's going to be developer led, is you're talking about removing cables, removing panels, reinstating back to agriculture, service roads, etc., all being put back. And at the beginning there would be a record of condition in order to have something to refer back to understand what it looked like. So obviously 25 years time hence it could be considerably different. But I mean, I haven't come across any developers that have resisted having a reinstatement obligation. There is usually a conversation about trying to avoid, from their perspective, duplication of effort, in that quite often it could be a planning condition as well. So it's really a case of both parties being comfortable with what provisions might be put in place and who's best protected by it. Because obviously from the landowner's perspective, we'd much rather see something that was directly related to them rather than necessarily to the third party, to the council, from a reinstatement obligation. But it's certainly something that should be a key factor of any discussion.
Richard, I mean, presumably, if you're taking, from a financing perspective, if you're taking security on a project and the installation of the project could impact the value of that security, you'd be pretty concerned about that, wouldn't you?
About remediation, I think at a large project finance scale, certainly. But to be honest, as a financier, I aim to be out and repaid long before the end of a project's life. So providing I'm comfortable with that, it's something that I would expect there to be contractual provisions that that the operator kind of has those obligations and is in a position to do so. But my view would typically be, by the time we get to the end of the project's life, I'm kind of in the rearview mirror.
You're on the beach. John, is this something that you come across in terms of, does it cause problems at all, or do people generally agree either way with what's going on and they're happy with it, both parties?
I think a few of the members that I've spoken to, having the ones that are now quite a few years into large scale solar, are now having a few reservations about the sustainability of the whole process. In terms of removing the solar at the end of the project, if a project is written down for 20 to 25 years, it's going to make all its money in that time. The guys that are actually operating that project and benefiting most from it are the people that probably installed the organisation. The landowner tends to just get paid a flat fee for the land usage. Now, if there's planning stipulations that say it must be removed at the end of the process, then I think that's probably something that needs to be taken into account seriously. If there aren't such planning stipulations, then a solar panel which is maybe 20 years old is probably still going to be producing 75 or 80% of the power that it produced on day one. So is there some logic in the argument to actually leave them in place until they become unviable?
I was going to say that. I mean, yes. I mean, when is there a point where a solar panel stops working? What does it get to 40 years and it just literally stops? Or has anyone? What's the longest running solar panel? Do we know what that is? Does such a thing exist?
I don't think they kind of just have a point where they completely fall off the edge. I think you get into diminishing returns as they age, but we're still in a position whereby the solar panels that were first manufactured 40, 50 years ago are still, a lot of them are still producing power, albeit at a much lower level than they did originally. I think the majority of attrition on solar panels tends to be through physical damage or delamination or something like that, rather than the failure of the actual silicon.
Absolutely, it's a question. Tim, just briefly, from your perspective as a national energy project operator, just bring people up to speed on where we are in terms of UK energy mix at the moment, because we've got about 15 minutes to go. Just looking at the opportunities going forward, there is still huge opportunity here, isn't there, for generation on farm? Because quite simply, would it be fair to say there is not enough power being generated?
Yeah, that's the easy answer to that is just yes. I mean, if anyone's driven around the countryside, you've gone up to particularly the M62 corridor, you will see that the existing coal-fired power station that were there until quite recently, are gradually being demolished and removed. So the UK is decarbonising to start off with. So we're removing our fossil fuel generation, but also we are removing that baseload generation. So when I talk about baseload, I talk about stuff that can be started and stopped, can be controlled, and is there to generate constantly if possible. So coal, nuclear, gas, for example. If you take the gas side of things, we're not developing that many new gas-fired power stations at the moment. If you look at nuclear, well, there are very few developments there. Hinkley is due to come on sometime in the next 5 to 7 years, and hopefully that will address some of the baseload requirements. But we're still, as a country, short of baseload power, and therefore, if we're going to use energy production, particularly renewable, intermittent renewable energy, we need to think about that generation, but also that storage and how it's utilized. And can we get more agile? Can we get more sensible about how we use energy? Do we do things more at times when there is excess, renewable production? Do we charge our cars up, not just traditionally overnight, but when it's particularly windy in the winter or particularly sunny during the summer, for example? So I think there's lots of opportunities. Certainly fundamentally we need more generation, and secondly we need to be more sensible how we use energy, electricity, energy. Don't use it to start with, it's the obvious one, but then if you have to use it, be more agile, think around how you use that energy to make best use of it.
And I mean, there entail the fact that there's not enough energy and we've got this spiky market. Presumably, John, that means lots of your clients are not only looking at the opportunity to generate, but presumably their other priority is to make their businesses more resilient and isolate from that spiky market.
Yeah, I think you've got two very different points here. You've got the point where generators are producing power to go directly back to the grid, but you've got a whole raft of decentralized generation that's coming on week in, week out in this country. Somebody told me sometime last year that there is several 100,000 hectares of usable roof space in this country on commercial, agricultural, industrial buildings that could actually be installed with solar PV, for example, and that kind of thing is something that the farming members that we have in AF are very, very good in terms of installing power and contributing to this power community that we're building, and that all assists the decentralized nature of it. We've got to get away, I think, from the centralized power plant image that we had back in the 40s and 50s when things were really starting out.
And everyone just had 2 light bulbs and no iPhones to power. Larry, presumably your clients, are you seeing exactly that people are either seizing an opportunity to generate, or they're making their businesses more resilient by doing their own? That's the reason why they're generating, because they don't want to be paying spiky power bills.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, pardon me. Yeah. This energy security point was a key one for a number of clients, where isolating themselves from spiky markets, and particularly those that use quite a bit, and also where they've had the opportunity to start self-developing and actually get better returns. I mean, we touched on earlier, for particularly those early in the solar process who were landowners that just got a base rent and that was it. And as markets have matured, the rental models have changed and updated, but increasingly, where they can do it themselves, they stand to make the most benefit from it. And just touching on the point about the solar and the acreage of the solar roof, I think it was BEIS did a report, was it last year before, sort of the solar revolution, and I think there was a huge amount of capacity that was identified on existing rooftop that could be developed pretty quickly. I think the big challenge that's coming down is grid, and there are significant investments into grid in order to actually provide these opportunities. The number of clients that approach to say, I'd love a renewables installation on my land of whatever description, how can I get one? And the first thing you always look at is, well, where is grid, where is capacity? And regrettably, more often than not, the question is, or the answer is, well, I'm sorry, there's no capacity where you are. The earliest indication is it's going to be 2036 or whatever it happens to be. So, I think grid has a huge challenge ahead of it. I know they've done a lot of work recently on changing how they consider the likes of battery storage against capacity, and they're also changing the, if you want to call it, the queuing system to make sure that projects progress through and actually adhere to the timetable. But actual capacity is a big problem, and there's a huge amount of investment needed.
Richard, when the good lobbyists at Lloyd's Bank go and sit down and have tea with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, which they must do from time to time, I mean, are you getting them to tap them on the back of the head with a pen and say, "Oh, come on, we've got to sort this grid thing out"? Because you guys must look at it from an investment profile and just weep a bit because what you could be doing and you're not doing.
I'll probably say that when the lobbyists and the senior people at Lloyd's are called to the Chancellor's office, it's probably not their priority. But I'd certainly echo what the other members of the panel are saying. When I look at the conversations I've had around clients looking to generate their own power, 10 years ago, it was purely for PR purposes. And then 2 to 3 years ago, it was most of the large corporates had to do something or another. And now it's just across the board. Everybody is looking to do it, whether you're a true believer and you want to play your part in net zero, or whether you just simply want to insulate your business from price volatility. It's what we're seeing across the board, and trying to do our bit where we can to help spread the message of what you can do and how you might practically be able to do that, and hopefully provide some funding in the process.
And how do you gauge that opportunity? I mean, in the marketplace for funding, I mean, in terms of the journey, whether we're on the journey towards net zero or the first instinct for any commercially minded person is the journey to isolate themselves away from power spikes in the market. Are we just literally starting to get on that road, or are we some way down it, do you think?
I think you probably possibly given me the most difficult question, Hugh. Look, I think the sense that I get is that it is increasingly being seen as an opportunity rather than necessarily as a cost, right? Business investment across the UK has been in the doldrums for 15 years. There is now an opportunity to address the volatility which people are seeing. It may necessarily have been influenced at least by geopolitical aspects, but there's an opportunity to completely take yourself out of that and create a whole new, more secure business model, much more long term. So whilst I think if you take kind of as a range of businesses, there is a relatively early stage. A lot of people have done LED lighting within the agriculture sector, obviously much more ahead than the broader corporate sector. But I do think that the conversations we're having and the frequency with which we're having them means that the momentum is building quite fast.
Yeah, so it's good. That's going to have pressures on the market. It's going to have pressures on availability of hardware. The reason we give you the most difficult questions, Richard, because you are the head of complex transactions. That's your official title. You don't just get a title like that and not get the tricky questions. Now, actually, funnily enough, Louis Clabban, your colleague, John, he's questioned, if we all undertake more renewable projects, can the electricity network grid cope with extra generation? And yes, well, we said no. The answer is no. The grid has got to change radically if the generation is going to be exported to all these various places. Let's just have a quick final roundup. Larry, just talk us through your view on funding at the moment and funding that is available from be it government. Obviously, it's different north of the border than it is south of the border. Is there any funding available? I mean, what could you get from the government from any schemes? What's on the market? Is there anything?
Regrettably, not as much as there used to be. That's for sure. But yeah, I mean, I think there are still some potential opportunities, particularly from a rural perspective under the basic payment scheme. There should hopefully be further rounds under the transitional side of things, but it's a question of how much money the government puts into that in order to create the pot again. So, and I think government support has always been this thing of where they want to support establishment of different markets, but once they mature, they generally step back from it again. And I think that's where we've reached, is most of these technologies are now mainstream, and therefore there's not much by way of support. Some of the ones where there is still a bit of support is the emergence of hydrogen and those sorts of schemes. And I know we've not really touched on them, but there are still green gas scheme which is supporting, and that also would apply to the AD plant side of things as well. So there is, depending on where you look and what you're looking for, there is still opportunities. But I think also actually from a funding perspective, there's much more appetite, as Richard was saying, potentially from different lenders because this is seen as a much more commonplace opportunity.
And presumably, Tim, if there's too much funding, or when I priced up solar arrays when the feed-in tariff was 22p, and then saw the difference in the cost of the hardware when it went to 11p, and now what it is, I mean, the funding and these little grants, they do distort the market, don't they, in terms of the value of the hardware?
I think, yeah. Years and years ago, under the renewable obligation scheme, I did a little exercise looking at cost of offshore wind versus how many rocks you got. And lo and behold, the cost of the capex went up with the number of rocks. So there is always an argument that the subsidy drives the capex. I think the interesting thing, I was just making some notes here. I mean, this time last year, we're heading towards energy prices going up to roughly 60 to 80 pence a kilowatt hour for an average consumer. It sort of drives the question about whether or not funding is needed, or are you looking to self-fund, to avoid that exposure. No business, no home can cope with long-term energy prices like that. And I think that's what the interesting thing about it. Do you look at self-funding it? Do you get a third party in? There are opportunities here that the energy is now mainstream from environmental, from sustainability, from security, from funding opportunities. There's lots of opportunities to develop either yourself or get somebody else to do it for you.
Yeah, and typically, John, at the moment, just to bring us up to date with pricing, your exports, what would the sort of market that for export be at the moment? Someone with solar PV, what should they be getting?
Well, at the moment, I think the market rate today was relatively low. It has gone up a little bit this week, and then last week a few pence. So it's not right at the rock bottom anymore. But what we're encouraging our AF members who are exporting to do, and most of those we locked into a good contract back in January, so they're getting far higher than what is currently the market rate. We're also encouraging them to look at the ancillary parts of their generation, things like REGOs, which I think Larry mentioned, and try and leverage some additional capital from those. I imagine this is something that Tim also probably has some views on. But relatively speaking, the cost of solar PV has not shot up in the last few years. It bottomed out about 2 years ago, maybe 18 months. But from that lowest position, it hasn't gone up dramatically. And given the price rises we've seen in electricity, it still pays off quite handsomely, and other types of generation as well.
And typically, what is a UK average today spot price for an exported kilowatt hour off a solar panel?
Again, this might be one that Tim will be able to answer more accurately than me, but I saw some prices that were around 10 or 11p today.
Yeah. I was about to say, I've got 7 pence roughly for this summer, for the balance of summer at the moment, because prices are quite low because we've got too much sun and wind. You're looking at 11 to 13 pence for the winter, and probably 10 to 12 pence for next summer. So roughly that's sort of 10 to 13 pence longer term around it. The other interesting thing just to note about REGOs are really important. So these renewable energy guarantees of origin, if your scheme is accredited for it, they are worth a fair chunk of money now, because the suppliers need to show that they're supplying green energy. And the other thing that's worth noting here is that National Grid revitalised their demand flexibility service offering for the winter, which was they brought in last summer. We got paid to reduce your energy demand. There's lots of interesting thoughts around that, whether or not you're a big energy demand consumer. So if you've got big compressors, cold stores on site, can you switch them off for an hour here and there, or sort of aggregation plays for adding together a number of sites where you reduce demand. So there's quite a fair bit in the news at the moment looking at this winter coming.
And just very quickly, these REGOs, these renewable energy guarantees, so how much extra? So if you gave me a deal for, say, we did a deal for this winter, we locked in at 12p for typically the 6-month period of the winter for my export. Would I get extra money on top of that if I had one of these REGO guarantees as well?
Yes, and they are possible to sell them separately as well. So if you're either bundled in a PPA or you can sell them separately. That there's arguments to say they really should be bundled in with a PPA, but there are a number of generators that trade them separately as a commodity.
So what this REGO is, it's basically a guarantee that the power that I'm putting into the system is coming from a renewable source, effectively.
It's a bit like your sort of red tractor symbol. You know, you can actually point to it. If I really wanted to, I could track my megawatt hour of energy I consume back to a point of generation. So I can, identify the wind farm or the solar PV array that generated that megawatt of hour that I've consumed of power.
And typically, what does that get? How much added value do I get on my, say, 12p?
You get one REGO is a megawatt hour of power, and depending on who you're talking to, they go anything between about £3 to £8 a megawatt hour. So that's what 0.3 to 0.8 pence a kilowatt hour, if my maths is correct.
Yeah, so cumulatively, it adds up over a lot of time. So
yeah.
More opportunity in the world of power. It is endless what's going on. We haven't managed to answer everyone's questions. Thank you so much to everyone who sent in questions, particularly the live questions. I must just mention Bruce Dolby, because he did send a question in before, and he sent a question on the text. And Bruce has got a website called batchpasteurizer.com. And he's looking for trial farms because he reckons he's cracked it. Okay, guys, Bruce is going to use biomethane from the cows and turn it into electrical power to power the batch pasteurizer. So there you go. See, that's ingenuity and innovation in action in the British economy, despite the fact that the power grid is utterly under capacity at the moment and needs huge investment. So we can really see this one fly. But there's loads of opportunities, certainly on farm, whether you are looking to produce on a micro scale for yourselves and to effectively isolate yourselves from the spiky power market, which looks to be sticking around for some time to come. It leaves me one last thing to do is really to thank our esteemed panel tonight for being with us. Tim Foster, Head of Energy Services at Conrad Energy, thank you very much. Larry Irwin, Senior Associate Director, Renewables Team at Stratton Parker up near Aberdeen, thank you very much. John Wadeson, Renewables Specialist at the AF Group in Norwich, thank you. And the man had the trickiest question, but he's got the most complex title because he is Richard Pretty, the Head of Complex Transactions at Lloyds Bank. Thank you very much for your time tonight as well, guys. It's been really brilliant. I hope all of you people listening have found it useful. This will be packaged up as a podcast, so if you miss something, you can spool back, or indeed this is a message to you latecomers who didn't bother to turn up to the live event, but you'll still get the link to the podcast. You're still included, but it wasn't live. But anyway, thank you for registering as well. But look, I hope everyone's found it really useful. There are a whole load of other transition podcasts available on the Farmers Weekly podcast channel as well as the weekly Farmers Weekly podcast that I present every week, the UK's leading farming podcast. That's out there for you as well. But look, you need to get away. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to my panel. And until the next webinar, thank you very much.